Well, good afternoon, friends. Welcome to Face with Racism, difficult conversations about covert forms of racism. My name is Jeffrey Moore, and I'm the lead pastor at St. Stephen United Methodist Church here in Mesquite, Texas.
And I'm Heather Goddess, and I'm the Minister of Youth and Young Adults.
And we're here this afternoon with Dewey Marshall, and hopefully Chris Robinson will be joining us soon to talk about housing disparities and how housing disparities serve as a covert form of racism and white supremacy. So I'm going to let Dewey introduce himself and say a few introductory words or thoughts. He brings a lot of expertise to the table, so we're really glad to have him this afternoon. Dewey.
Yeah, this is great. Thank you so much, Jeffrey and Heather, for having me on. I'm really excited to be here. My name is Dewey Marshall, like Jeffrey said. I work for the North Texas Fair Housing Center. We're an independent nonprofit, and we advocate in cases of housing discrimination. I've been passionate about housing justice my whole life. Between the years of 2012, 2017, I was in and out of homelessness, at all tiers of homelessness, and all levels of housing insecurity when I was housed. I've been involved in community organizing since 2015. I've been involved, reading anti-racist literature and writing since 2010. So when I started my current job at the North Texas Fair Housing Center a year ago, I thought that I had a good understanding of how structural powers function in racist ways. I kind of knew a lot of structural racism and how it played out. And I thought that the housing crisis is racist because it disproportionately affects Black people and people of color. But what I've learned is something different. I thought that the housing crisis creates racism through the way that it systematically works, and the impacts of the housing crisis disproportionately affects and impacts people in racist ways. I've since learned that that's not quite true. It's that more of the racism created that housing crisis, and through the ways that housing is developed. So fair housing, when people think of fair housing, they think of whether or not an individual housing situation is fair, like my landlord's charging me too much rent and stuff like that. In legal terms, is kind of code for housing discrimination. So specifically based off of a protected class, and in federally, the classes are pretty limited. Texas doesn't have any extra classes of protection. So fair housing is the concept that where you live matters, and that is true with pretty much everything, especially equity. And the organization under that my organization is a chapter of, it's called the National Fair Housing Alliance. Their policy experts say that we are a heavily segregated country, and that segregation was created deliberately by governing on local, state, and federal levels, working closely with the private sector for several years. So I am going to just talk a little bit. I know this is a discussion. I can go on and give a brief overview of the fair housing practices that kind of led me to think these, or I can answer some questions.
No, I think go ahead and give us a little bit of background. I think that would be helpful.
Okay, great. Yeah, so in all of this, I'm not the expert. I just have read some stuff. So I'm going to be referring to a bunch of different things for people to read on their own too, because I think it's really important. So the fair housing, the first Fair Housing Act that we see from the federal government historically was not anti-racist. We typically think of the Fair Housing Act of 1968. But in the mid and late 1930s, the zoning development was really big in the North. And the guidelines for developers to have that type of zoning for housing was actually issued by the federal government, and it classified for zoning by race and national origin. So we see at the same time that historically we know that a bunch of immigrants were coming into the U.S., the U.S. was also planning itself in a way to zone any immigrants and people of color, and it's definitely Black people, out of any type of equity. And that's kind of known during the Reconstruction era in the South, but in the North, it actually got formalized into a manual, and it got turned into a manual of how to racially segregate, and it was the tool for developers to use to zone. And that later got named the Federal Housing Administration, which is still around today. And that's the basis of the Federal Housing Administration. So that was, with a private industry, the appraisals were also ranked based off of how people, like what kind of people live there, where those people came from. And we don't see any type of break from this, and all of the type of impacts that brings, like incarceration rates and education rates and all of that. We don't see any type of change in direction at all, really, in the housing world until 1968 with the Civil Rights movement. So 1968 comes, we passed the Fair Housing Act, which protects limited classes. Even at the time that it was passed, it only protected race, color, religion, national origin, and I'm sure I'm forgetting something, but I don't know, because the discrimination in gender weren't even in it. So disability and gender weren't even in the original Fair Housing Act. And I'm also a little bit nervous being live too. So I might have missed a couple of protected classes at first, but it was limited. It was really, really limited. And so even as soon as that was passed, we see like the backlash from that politically isn't continuing momentum in a direction that tries to share housing equity. It actually, people just backlash against the Fair Housing Act in ways that we're seeing today, which I'm sure we'll get into affirmative fair housing and disparate impact. But the patterns that we saw from the 1930s, both in the North and in the South, which I can talk about too, have not stopped at all, and the interests haven't stopped. I can look at a map of Dallas, for example, like the area, the Mesquite area, and I can see historically how Black neighborhoods and neighborhoods of color have moved around the city and around the Dallas area, while white neighborhoods have not. And that same generational wealth and equity is actual land. It's actually land in North Dallas that hasn't changed. So that's kind of overall in the country what happened. There's a lot that happened in Dallas too. Most of what I just said over the information about the country came from the National Low Income Housing Coalition or the National Fair Housing Alliance. For people listening and viewing that are interested in housing disparities in Dallas and have not read the book, The Accommodation, I think really, really need to. It's no longer in print, so you just have to email some housing activist in Dallas that has a copy of it. It's by Jim Schultz, who is still an author for D Magazine. And it goes over the exact history in Dallas. And I am not going to do it justice at all. And so I'm just going to talk about what the book talks about instead of trying to go in and cover what it says. In 1936, we see the Federal Housing Administration in the North get solidified into actual policy. And for us that know history in the South in the 1930s, we also know that was the resurgence of the Klan. And those two aren't disconnected. Those two are connected in the South. The way that housing policy was developed, especially in Dallas, was heavily, heavily influenced from the Klan. So keep in mind that before 1968, redlining, or the practice that people commonly know about of zoning things, particularly based on race, was totally legal. And in fact, oftentimes people thought it's best for Black neighborhoods and neighborhoods of color to be redlined. So in 1936, we also see, coming out of the Great Depression, just a series of bombings across Dallas from the Klan. And we know it was the Klan bombing Black neighborhoods. And it still is happening, but it kind of did randomly until about the mid 1940s when people start coming back from war. All of this is from The Accommodation, the book, but as we see people come back from war, we see wealth and actual money start to come into the city. And it creates a class divide actually between the working class white people and the wealthy white people who are already all around Dallas. That money kind of floating around makes like intense white neighborhoods start to sprawl out. And then we see another heavy series of bombings in the late 1940s, early 1950s, anonymous bombings that had the same patterns of the Klan into black households that were in white neighborhoods or were too close to white neighborhoods. Even if a black household, even if a black family moved in to an area that was just too close. And this is all happening at a time where like no more like housing, black like residential housing has been expanded upon. And so we essentially, like, black people just don't have anywhere to go, and over generations start moving in, just consolidating housing. So high density housing in black neighborhoods in the late 1940s, early 1950s, and still today. We'll get to that. But yeah, kind of skipping ahead. So as these bombings start happening, the response from the city at the time was, oh, this is really bad. But it's really no one's fault because there's not enough segregation, that, you know, it's not really the white people's fault. And this is a direct quote. Actually, hold on. From at the time, the guy, the mayor Wallace Savage. I was just reading this just to kind of prepare for this. And what his quote about these bombings is, he uses the word Negro in this because that's the language at the time. So he says, neither the man who threw the bomb nor the Negro who moved into the white neighborhood is primarily responsible. There have practically been no Negro housing built in Dallas since the war. Negroes are living 2, 3, 4 families in small dwellings, and it's impossible to keep them overflowing into white areas unless places are provided for them. Also keep in mind, though, that these white neighborhoods had not been white neighborhoods before the war. So that is a very loose definition, too. So skip to 2020, I'll wrap it up. We see neighborhoods like the economic neighborhoods in Dallas, like Uptown and Deep Ellum are white neighborhoods, but they used to be black neighborhoods. Uptown was a black neighborhood until the 1950s. Deep Ellum was a black neighborhood until the 80s. And black neighborhoods and neighborhoods of color, like I said, have moved all over the city, like those examples, but the white neighborhoods have not. Preston Hollow has been the same demographic and the same generations, and the Highland Parks and all of that have been the same generations. In the 1950s, bombings were coming out of Preston Hollow area, and so if that area hasn't changed, I'm wondering now, a year after being in fair housing and being passionate about affordable housing, what makes me think that the Klan has been ran out of Preston Hollow? I mean, that's not true. It hasn't. We saw, I mean, I was there organizing when Trump got elected, that the resurgence of like neo-Nazis is really big, especially threats against Muslims at the time of the Muslim ban. But the actual Klan wasn't really invested under a microscope and was pushed under the city of Dallas during the 1950s bombings, which set up our current segregation system. And when I think about the fact that the Klan is, when I say the Klan, I don't even mean going to meetings with white hoods on. I mean, it's the same people making decisions because it's the same people that have equity. And what makes me think that that's left City Hall? And it hasn't. Michelle Alexander does a good job in her book of kind of describing what happened in the 80s with like cities where as we got more industrialized globally, like black neighborhoods saw their equity drain out. That happened in Deep Ellum. That's why there's, like vacant warehouses and stuff all across Deep Ellum. And that war on drugs is still, that racist war on drugs is creating the housing crisis, because people that have a record, I deal with this all of the time. People that have a record can't find housing. And it's really hard to enforce the small guidelines that HUD even provided in 2015 about it. There's almost no enforcement, especially in the courts and in the circuit. And so that's also like how racism creates the housing crisis. It's not that the housing crisis is racist.
Okay, so there's a lot to unpack there.
Yeah, sorry.
No, that's okay. It's sort of like drinking from a fire hose. Let's just go back to one topic, because one of our viewers, John Astol, brought up and you mentioned redlining. So we know that redlining happened. We know that it was legal. And I assume that it sort of was part of that machinery that you mentioned at the beginning of public-private partnerships developing housing policy, which developed into the FHA, the Federal Housing Administration. But as you pointed out, we adopted the Fair Housing Act in '68, right? We wiped that out. Isn't like slavery, isn't that in the past? Like that's just something we read about in a book?
Yeah.
Or are there legacies to redlining that still are with us today?
There are definitely legacies of redlining.
Or are there
and not even legacies, active discrimination happening with zoning.
Okay, say more about that.
So zoning first starts on a local level. When that happens with zoning for the local level, like currently local jurisdictions like cities have some type of standard that they have to uphold, but there's also no enforcement of that standard since 2015. So the opportunity to actively segregate is still there, and it still is like how it was between or how it was an agreement between private firms and the government. It's still that way. So local apartment lobbyists in Dallas, it's the AAGD, Apartment Association of Greater Dallas. On the state level in Texas, it's the Texas Apartment Administration. Both of those entities, we know that they still have an investment in segregation because they oppose specific ordinances, and they're very effective in protecting people against segregation. So, for example, we see that like we think of segregation now as a lot of housing vouchers, for example, which is still in court in Dallas with a major property company only accepting vouchers in specific areas of Dallas, leading to what's called a desperate impact. Like the disparity is just so great that it doesn't have to be individually zoned. You know, a zoning development, a housing complex can let in 1 or 2 white people and have 500 units. And that's still obviously like a black, or if it's filled with a bunch of black occupants, it's still a black like occupied building, or a building occupied by people of color. The way to prove that, even proving that it is a black occupied building, takes the court. The lawyers have to go through such a process with the courts, it almost assuredly gets thrown out, especially in Texas. That hasn't changed in years. So this is still active. On the state level, the Texas Apartment Administration famously blocked in 2015 any ordinance being passed that would stop apartments from discriminating against how people get their income. What that means is apartments can say that they won't rent to people with housing vouchers. So a local ordinance, the city of Dallas actually tried to pass a local ordinance saying that every apartment complex has to accept people, or no apartment complex can deny people because of housing vouchers. But we know that segregation is still here because the same people, like the same interests, the apartment lobbyists, went to the state and stopped like all of that from happening, stopped any local ordinance from being passed on the state level. The state, instead of enforcing more fair housing, literally makes it illegal for local ordinances to promote fair housing in that way.
Right. So we've seen this with Faith in Texas in other areas where the state has come in and overruled local control and prevented local control, whether it's, planting trees or cutting down trees or housing vouchers or whatnot. So what you're saying, what I hear you saying is, just with Section 8, for example, when we started Section 8 housing, it was actually physical housing, right? We built apartment complexes and then we filled those with people that needed housing assistance. Then at some point we transitioned out of that into issuing people vouchers, presumably because we want to make this more market friendly. So now these people have a voucher in hand. They go out into the market, they can find any housing they want, right? But what you're saying is, even if you have a voucher in your hand, that doesn't mean you can get housing, because people can still legally discriminate against you because you have a voucher. Is that right? Is that what you're saying?
Oh, definitely. Yeah, they're encouraged to. The apartment lobbyist encourages them in their practice to specifically like not rent to people with housing vouchers. And that's landlords also encourage each other to not rent to people with housing vouchers.
Yeah.
And I see that there's also, anecdotally, I see this all the time. There's also studies that back it up. There's a 2017 study from Inclusive Communities Project that finds, I don't know what the number is, but it's around like well over like 70% of housing providers in North Texas don't provide to people with housing vouchers because they have housing vouchers.
So where do these people go?
Yeah, I mean that's the housing crisis. They're on the street right now. Yeah. Yeah.
Well, I would think that they go to places that accept those vouchers, and those places tend to be in portions of the city that are underdeveloped and broken down and lack grocery stores, and there are places where they can where investors can easily make money without having a lot of expenses.
That's exactly right, and that happens in a couple of areas in Dallas.
We've experienced this actually with a member of our community whom we stepped in to try to help. She had a housing voucher in hand. She could not get secure property. We finally were able to sort of get the wheels of things moving. But now she's in a house that the landlord has no interest in upkeep and taking care of and maintaining. So the landlord isn't even meeting basic livable conditions because there's nothing in it for him. I mean, from his perspective, right? He's trying to put as little into the project. I mean, it's not a project, but the house, the investment as possible, and just collect the housing, the money off the voucher.
That's why I use the term investor lightly.
Right, right.
Yeah.
We have another member of our community that has told me about several Section 8 voucher residents who have come into her neighborhood, and she has watched the properties decline over time. And she and I have talked about the fact that this is not the residents, right? It's the landlords, or I suppose in some cases landladies, it's the landowners, the property owners, who are not taking proper care of their property. And so, she's concerned about her property values, but that's not because of the Section 8 voucher holders. That's because of the property owner.
Yeah, that happens. A couple of things on that. First, I think that if somebody is questioning about, housing discrimination, our agency, the North Texas Fair Housing Center, was founded off settlement money from suing banks about how they handled real estate owned properties or properties that were seized by banks or foreclosed on after the housing market collapsed. And then they found in Black and brown neighborhoods, the properties were just left to crumble, like absolutely crumble. I mean, and a lot of federal banks had to pay a settlement, and that's why I have a job. So yeah, if housing discrimination didn't exist, I wouldn't be here. And I see also the partnership of landlords with government there, because how it should work is a housing authority that gives vouchers should have a contract negotiated with property owners that are accepting vouchers from the clients. These contracts, I mean, and I work, I don't want to know what housing authority that you're talking about, but I work with a lot of housing authorities, and some of them are great at having the documents ready, just the contract, and that includes upkeep. And, you know, caseworkers from the housing authority are supposed to keep the property owners accountable for that type of, you know, that issue that you're describing. When that doesn't happen, I don't know who to go to, and this is my job, because who holds the government accountable in like the government system? Like, you know, there's the only thing to do is to try to get a private attorney, and like I said, in this circuit, it's hard to get past anything. The best attorneys are in Dallas. The firm Daniel Bashara is working with Inclusive Communities Project. They're also representing the Shingle Mountain case, which is a racist zoning thing that people should look up if they haven't heard. And they're the only people that can do stuff, and they can't do everything. So there's, you know, that's how that discrimination is still going. That's a housing crisis, but the system for that to exist that you're describing was created to zone out people of color and Black people. Like, it's the same system from 85 years ago.
And I'm sure, I mean, we don't have time to get into them right now. Perhaps we can talk about them in the next segment. But there are other intersectionalities at work here, like access to credit. If you can't get access to credit, then you can't purchase the house that you might otherwise be eligible to purchase and maintain, and you know, et cetera, et cetera. So that keeps certain persons, demographics, Blacks, Hispanics, et cetera, out of certain markets.
Right.
In addition to other things. Well, we've come to the close of our live segment. You've given us a lot to talk about. I'm going to have to go back and watch this segment several times in order to unpack everything.
I've included a lot of links in the Facebook stream, and so as you are going through and absorbing all this information, this, I feel like, is a very research-heavy topic. So John Assel, I know you are so in heaven right now. But as we go through and learn more, and we are absorbing this information and sorting through it, be kind to yourself, take breaks, and just remember that we are becoming anti-racist the same way we eat an elephant, one bite at a time. We'll see you all next week when we talk about something else.
Educational disparities.
Oh, educational disparities. So disparities in our school systems. Ooh, we've got lots of teachers in our group. This is going to be fun.
Look for our backstage segment to come out on Tuesday afternoon. In the meantime, take care of yourself, and we'll see you later.
Bye, everybody.